Hello all, and welcome to today's webinar with GovTech, Efficiency in Action, Tech Strategies that Save Time and Budget on Capital Projects. This webinar is sponsored by Kahua. A few housekeeping notes. My name is Kurt Wood. I'm the Senior Fellow with the Center of Digital Government, and I will be hosting this panel today with a couple of our outstanding guests, or I should say commentators, panelists. Let me go through a couple of housekeeping notes first. You can participate in the Q&A by submitting your questions using the Q&A widget. We'll address as many questions as possible during the live webinar. If we don't get to your question, we'll be certainly to follow up with you to provide an answer. Please check the related content widget in your console for additional information. A recording of this presentation will be available to all registrants within 48 hours. We also encourage you to complete a brief survey. We'd like to hear what you think. It helps us for the future. To planning and executing on these webinars. And if you experience any issues or other technical problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help widget. So with me today, we have a couple of folks that I'll let them introduce themselves, but we have Nicholas Johnson, Chief Evangelist for Kahua, and Carrie Stieglitz, the co-founder of KVOL. So Nicholas, why don't you introduce yourself, give a little bit of background to the audience, who you are and why you're here today.
Glad to, Kurt, and thank you for having me. Happy to be here. We love GovTech presentations and love being part of this family, if you will. So I'm Nicholas Johnson. I've been with Kahua for about 4.5 years, but interestingly worked for the founders of Kahua when they founded their first software company, which was called Constructware. They pulled me out of a career in design services and brought me into the world of construction technology. And I've known the guys, Brian Moore, Scott Unger are our two primary founders, and worked for them until we sold that first company to Autodesk in 2006. You know, we all went into the Autodesk corporation at that point. A few years later, we had all scattered all over the place, but I was reunited with the team just a little less than 5 years ago. I've spent, Kurt, I love talking with you because like you, I'm in my 5th decade in this industry. Yep. So I've done a lot of things. I've had some leadership roles at Autodesk, at Trimble, at Beck Technology. Most proud that I took a couple 2-year working sabbaticals and did some nonprofit work. First time I did that, I became a nonprofit cause myself, so I had to go back to the commercial world. But,
exactly.
Yeah. But was proud to be able to do that a couple times. But when the chance came to work for Brian and Scott again, there was nothing like it in my career before, and there's been nothing like it. This is the best job I've ever had. I love what we're doing here. We're kind of changing the industry. We did that 25 years ago at Constructware when we created the first internet-based project management application. Kahua is doing some of the very same things with our platform technology and our asset-centric approach to project management. So really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's great. It's great. Great background. Thanks, Nick. Carrie, on to you.
Yeah. So Carrie Stieglitz, co-founder of KVOL, and we are an organization that specifically works with technology and cloud-based solutions to match process to people and tools. So I've personally been in this industry. I actually just had to tell somebody I'm not 5 decades, I'm 2 decades and 2 decades plus. So, but basically been doing this my whole career. Very early on, recognized the value of technology. We were setting up a PMO for a public sector client, and you create these really great, binders, access databases. And, there was always this comment of there has to be a better way. So at some point got introduced to off the shelf PMIS solutions, and then, just kind of went from there. So our firm works, primarily public sector, state and local, and we are huge proponents, as you'll probably hear today, of the process has to be a driver for the technology. So making sure you have the right things in place before you really go into a technology solution, but also countered with people ask, hey, what's the best PMIS tool to work with? And I always like to say the one you can use tomorrow, because something is better than nothing and you'll learn as you go. So, there's that nice balance of moving quickly, but also understanding it's a journey and all technology becomes stale if you don't adapt to your business as it changes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, absolutely spot on. I can say, to Nicholas's comments, and myself being in government my whole career, and I retired a few years ago after 48 years with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and certainly in many executive roles, technology, operations within state agencies, and certainly been involved in some construction projects on the public safety side. And certainly sat as a cabinet member with the governor. So my counterparts in transportation and some of our other organizations certainly appreciate the importance of this. And I think what I'd say is, like, after all those years, it's refreshing to know that this is still evolving. And I think certainly in Massachusetts as well in other states, state government, local government has huge construction projects, right, with multi-billion-dollar projects, with a lot of responsibility. With that all comes that government. And I always think about, from a government official perspective, the scrutiny that comes on a government official, or the public awareness of things, where the private sector, sometimes it's not always out in the public. So certainly having the capability and capacity to manage a project, and the topic we're going to talk about today, I think, is so relevant and important. We've learned a lot of lessons over the years, with project failures, project overruns, and certainly having the right approach, the right management tools to successfully complete these projects is essential in government, for the public trust, and certainly the confidence of going forward. So we've got some great topics today, great points. I think both of you will provide the audience, and I'm so looking forward to it. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll question now for the audience. If you can just take a couple minutes to take a look at this. How would you describe your current project management process? And I think certainly depending on state, local government, what I found is over the years that not all government is created equal. Local government is much different than state government. Not all state governments the same. Different states to states are different. Even within agencies are different. But I do think that certainly, from a project management framework, I think having a consistent approach is certainly relevant today. And certainly critical in this space where we're talking about public safety, we're talking about financial responsibility. Certainly having capacity to kind of manage that. So. Nicholas, as we wait for the poll results, can you open up a little bit? Just as from an opening perspective, kind of what you've seen. You've talked a lot about it in your introductory, from your experience and everything. But can you share with the audience some of your experience, thoughts of what it takes to be successful today before we get into the actual kind of question and answer?
Well, if we're referring to what it would take for a government agency to be successful deploying this kind of tech,
yeah,
sure, happy to. I think the number one thing, and this would not have been true, Kurt, years ago. It wouldn't have been true probably 5 years ago, maybe not 3 years ago. But the number one thing right now, I think the number one concern when deploying anything is security.
Yeah.
It has risen to the top. We'd like to think it shouldn't have to be the number one concern, but it is now. So it's certainly a priority as vendors like Kahua are competing for work. We hear over and over again from the agency that is looking to procure software that security's got to be their first criteria. There is a hard checklist working in any government agency for good reason. There's a hard checklist that things you have to accomplish. And we've been very successful because we've accomplished all the things that governments are looking for. So I would say security is the utmost importance for that. And then, for public agencies, constituent reporting or stakeholder reporting, it's huge. Think about who an agency's clients are. And I'll go down to kind of the lowest, I don't want to say the lowest level, but a simpler level, K-12 education. We consider that a government entity. It is a government entity. It's a state and local. They have to report to every parent of every child in their district. You literally have to have reports for every parent. So the same is true for a county Department of Transportation or a state, Department of Administration. We all have to report to the constituents. Yes, there are governors, there are boards, but there's also the stakeholders or stockholders, if you will. And in a public agency, that's everybody in your constituent group, everybody in your jurisdiction. So the ability to report data out of whatever tool that you use is critical as well. And then perhaps this applies not just to government agencies, but life cycle management has become a real serious issue. We're happy about that. It's something that we feel that we're helping to advance, but owners of construction are finally learning to merge their teams together so that there's not a completely separate capital construction team and a maintenance and operations team, that those two really ought to work in sync with one another. So the tools need to accommodate that as well, because we have a historic problem. I'll be glad to explain that later, but we've got a problem of how we manage information in construction and then throw it all away when we take over a facility or a utility or a road. So life cycle management, I would put third on that list. Because it's public money, any tool set needs to have really robust cost control tools. That's a must-have. It's a kind of a qualifier. If you don't have that, you just don't get to play. Data ownership, kind of related to the asset conversation, but data ownership is critical because there are different kind of business processes and tools to accommodate those that restrict the ownership of the information. So for example, on a capital project, there's an owner, there's a contractor, there's an architect, there's a bunch of subcontractors and specialty engineering companies as well. Everybody contributes data. If they're doing that in some electronic tool, who owns that data? Where does it go? Who controls it? So those are questions that are critical to a government agency as they're looking to procure this kind of technology. And then finally, I would just say, echoing a point Carrie made a minute ago, that these solutions that anyone wants to take on, they have to be flexible and they have to be agile. So to be flexible, as Carrie said, it has to adapt to your process. You should not adapt your processes. And if you're a public agency, very often you cannot adapt your process to a technology. Therefore, your technology needs to adapt to your process. So that's what I mean by flexible. But there's more to that. I like to say that a cargo ship is flexible. It can haul all kinds of things. It can haul trains, and it can haul planes, and it can haul lots of those boxes that they stack up and people wind up making houses out of. A large shipping container, a large ship can hold lots of kind of containers, It's very flexible as to what it can do. But you can't turn that thing around very quickly. Okay. It can't change direction very quickly. So in addition to being flexible, I think, project management information systems, we refer to those as PMIS. PMIS tools need to be agile as well, because the board of directors or the board of governors or the county commission can change on a dime, and their requirements can change on a dime. Or an agency can change its area of jurisdiction. Congressional district might change, or the fire code might change. So you need to be able to adapt to those changing conditions, and you have to do that rapidly. Some kind of institutional software tools can be flexible, but if you want to make a change to the software that you've procured, and you have to go to the vendor to do that, and they put it on their list of things to change, it might cost you $1 million. It might take a year to get it done. So while it's flexible and can do many things, it's not necessarily agile. I think to be successful, your solutions have to be both flexible and agile. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking about what you're talking about there. Excuse me. I always think about government, and folks that don't work in government, certainly probably don't appreciate it at the time, but you look at how government operates, state and local, and, it's very crisis driven. It's reactionary. Certainly I think, we do our best to plan ahead. And certainly I think overall government does a great job of that. But life happens day to day. And to your point, events happen, emergencies happen, accidents happen, all things legislation, legal, new administrations at the local, state level. So certainly having that ability to adapt. And I loved your point about, for lack of a better term, adoption and change management. The technology needs to adapt, not the people at times. And I think certainly, we require people to, in government, we do expect, people to adapt to the use of technology, certainly, and becomes part of our life today. But to your point, when you run a big enterprise, when you run a big project, the principles stay the same, and you still have to serve the public. You still have to finish the construction. You still have all your rules and regulations. And I know, at least in my experience, and I'm sure you all have seen that over the years in your experience, that the regulatory framework around construction is brutal. And it's like, and it's
Absolutely.
not just one agency. It's not one agency that you need to get approval from, or one community body. So, having that information, to your point about having that data available, that you can extend it, you can use it, you can understand it, reporting back out to the community. I think in community and stakeholder engagement are so critical for success, especially in today's environment. I think, when we seem to be, as a society, very cynical of government at times and very suspicious of government. So having that ability to kind of report out and present people, the information when they need it is critical. So I think those are all great points. Fantastic. So, Carrie, before we get to the results of the poll, can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective? I mean, you heard Nicholas. You all been working together. You collaborate. You're on the ground working with the agency and stuff. How do you help people think about that? And before that, we're going to get back to life cycle management in a minute too, because I think that's a real critical point that we talk about, that I don't think people have a full appreciation of what we mean by that at times. But just add on to what Nicholas had to say, Carrie, please.
Yeah, so I'll start with a somewhat anecdotal story where I think it's a great representation of what we're talking about, which is this morning I was talking to a group, and we were talking about the new dual authentication as part of security, right? So that's a really great example of this constant balance government has to have, not just government, but other agencies, other companies as well, where we're becoming more secure. Okay, now we have dual authentication. And when we talk about the topic of this today, which is efficiencies, well, hey, guess what? Yes, we're more secure. We know there's a risk out there. It's super important. And at the same time, now I have to, have this dual authentication for everything I do. So it is that perfect balance of trying to abide by a lot of the restrictions that are put in place for government and finding ways to have efficiencies around that. So hitting on some of the other topics that Nicholas was talking about, like I'm very aligned, but I also, from the reporting standpoint, there are challenges because you do have so many stakeholders you're answering to. And I would also point out not just external stakeholders, but your internal stakeholders. So when we're talking about regulatory compliance, environmental compliance, we have our permitting department that's running certain things. We have FDA that we have to answer to. We have, hey, if we get federal funding, now there's a whole new set of requirements in how we manage our projects. And so there's a lot of different layers on top of something that is already complex, which is large capital projects. We primarily work with public sector, but we've worked with private sector as well. And I think sometimes the impression is that, that there's a huge difference between the two. I would argue that the public sector just has more flexibility, right? So if they want to do something, they just put money towards it and they do it. A government project, you have so much more justification, so many more steps that you need to go through. And so anything we can do to make a system kind of take away some of the redundancy of a person's job, I think that's really where we get the additional benefits that Nicholas was talking about.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's a great point. I think a great comparison as well. Let's take a quick look at the results. So, how would you describe your current project management process? So, audience, gave us looks like a mix of spreadsheets and digital tools, 71% or so. Does that surprise you, Nicholas or Carrie? That kind of response?
Carrie, I'll
I
let
was
you
gonna
answer
say, yeah,
first.
I was gonna say I'm not. And I think what we've seen as this really great movement in the industry is that a lot of technology is being implemented into construction. So if I could just talk, and Nicholas and I talk about this all the time, but there's like
Yeah.
this progression of how technology is used, right? So it usually started with the GC or the designer bringing in technology as a differentiator from their competitors, right? Hey, look at these great
Right.
dashboards we're going to
Interesting.
provide you as a program manager. And then eventually owners said, well, these are all great, but you keep the data at the end of the day. So going back to the data ownership piece of it. So now we saw this progression to the owner's system where the owner has these systems, but now you have this complexity of, okay, but the contractor and designer also have their own systems, we have ours. And so where those two don't always meet, sometimes we go back to manual things like spreadsheets and pass spreadsheets back and forth. And so I do think it's a progression of the industry. And there's some other new exciting things that are going on now that are taking us even beyond that. But I'll save that for later.
Okay, great. Nick, thoughts?
I'm surprised that the first section is as high as it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Giving it a little thought, I think for the overall industry, the AEC, the construction industry, I think that number would be lower. But as I think about it now, our audience that's on with us today represent government agencies. They represent the owners. And
Right,
government is good about pushing technology forward, about pushing a lot of things forward, about pushing social agenda forward, for example. So the government leads. We often complain that the government's too big and too expensive, but the truth is there's so much innovation in our world that would not have happened if government agencies had not sponsored it. So as I think about it now, I'm not surprised that there is a good percentage of fully digital and integrated on this list because we represent, if you will, a higher class of owner. Government agencies, as far as willingness to spend on improvement, government agencies often will lead that push. I'm not either surprised that that the largest number are laggards. Even though we're willing to be the leaders, I say that, but I say the overall industry is not quite doing as well. So, overall, the entire industry is full of laggards. I'm thankful that among government agencies, we are at least pushing to change those numbers.
Hey, that's a great observation. I think, the natural reaction is government is behind at times. And I appreciate your observation there because I do think, in my experience, government does tend to lead. They invest in the community, and I think the important component there is that they have a important mission that the private sector doesn't do. I'm certainly the private sector is part of it from a solutions perspective, but the responsibility lies with the town, lies with the state, lies with the county. When you need to do bridge construction, you need to do a roadway over a highway, or build some type of major infrastructure. That most of that infrastructure, if not all, is government owned, government managed, or at least directed, right? So I think to your point, and I've seen it over the years. I mean, we talked about length of service in 5 or 6 decades. I came in the business in the mid 70s, 1975, and we didn't have it. We had maybe an old mainframe, and I've seen my career kind of parallel some of the technology innovation around everything. So, and I think certainly in the software and just that better job. And I think the other component here, and I think this is where I think the software helps in a company like Kahua, is certainly, it helps, government become more efficient, but it's also more accountable, right? Because government really has to be accountable to the people that it serves, right? And I think, certainly we have challenges like everybody, but I do think that, that public scrutiny and that demand that government do it better and expected to do it better, So I think, having that, objective and goal in mind and having the framework to do so, I think is critical. So I think those are great points. So Carrie, I'm going to get back to the life cycle because I'm always fascinated by this. And, I use the term for years and it means many things to different people, but, talk a little bit about, why it's so critical. Life cycle management is so critical, to make sure that, these projects become successful. And again, I think, asset management, asset life cycle is such a huge term. And you talk about, Nicholas used the term integrated before. I think we talk about that, certainly kind of, having a different view, everybody having ownership of it, or at least engagement with it. Can you talk a little bit about, from your experience, how critical that is in the public infrastructure projects?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call, this is their life they're experiencing right now, which is, the old, I'm not going to say the old way of thinking, but as technology kind of developed, there were very specific point solutions that tended to be developed first. So when we look at, maintenance software, so, maintaining the asset, looking at asset life health components, what we can do there, it was developed specifically for that asset. And then we look at the project side, which was very complex and had specific needs, and it was developed to serve the construction project. And so in a lot of ways, prior to that, we probably did pay more attention to the asset life cycle, but then we got very narrowed and focused as this bespoke technology came out. Then what we began to notice was that technology creating a silo between the project and the long-term operation of that asset. And so that just naturally came up with the way that we manage data, though, we replaced one piece of technology in year one and another piece of technology in year six. So we have this disconnect there. So really a lot of the challenges we're seeing today isn't that people aren't doing everything that they're supposed to. It's how the technology can support and make it more efficient. So that life cycle and that infrastructure, the more we have aging assets that are now generating these capital replacement or renewal projects at a higher rate, we're expected to do more with a lot less in our budget. So we have to constantly be adapting. And we use the term efficiency. I also love the term effectiveness because it's that we have so many hours in the day. How do we apply that? How do we exploit technology to help us do more in a single day? And the lifecycle management piece of it is so critical because we don't want to be using technology to get this big mountain of data. And then once we get to handover, it's dropped into a drive or thrown in somebody's drawer, or we lose all of that really great data and have to start over. That's a huge point where it's just not efficient.
Yeah. That's, spot on again. I think about that. It's like when you finish something, you deliver something to a customer, and to your point, it goes in that proverbial drawer, right? And then it never to be seen again. So I think
never
having
to
that,
be seen again.
Yeah. I think, and I don't, traditionally, I haven't thought about that from a construction or infrastructure, right? But I think it's just, how it is, right? That's normal, right? Because part of the challenge in government is, everybody's on to the next gig right away. You finish something, and then you're right in the next day, you don't have time to breathe. You're right into the next one.
Right.
Nicholas, can you all kind of describe how you define project success beyond the ribbon cutting? Because I look at it from a government official, and I think, we've all seen plenty of, ribbon cuttings, right? With the shovels in the ground, and we have all of the politicians cutting in, the big gold scissors and everything like that. At the end of the day, the grunts, the people running the project still need to kind of go, and the agencies still need to kind of show up and run it. So what does success look like, in your world from that perspective? Right, Nicholas, and back to Carrie. Yeah.
Kurt, I'm gonna touch on a couple of things here. First, you said as a government guy, you got to move on to the next thing. Right.
Yep.
We understand that. And I'm going to back up a second and say, Carrie and I don't work for the same company, even though it looks like we're in the same office right now.
Right. Yeah, it's just down the hall.
And we do work together. As I'm a software vendor, she's a professional consultant and helps people improve their business and their business processes. She does that by deploying technology often. Sometimes it's just change management. Sometimes it's technology. We happen to be one of those technologies that she often deploys
Yeah.
I like to think because we're really good at what we do.
Yeah.
So just for clarity there, we're not on,
Yep.
we're kind of teammates, but we're not working for the same company. So,
Right.
but Carrie, like me, has spent her career focused on construction activity. Okay. So Kurt, I'm a construction guy. I'm a project guy. Now I'm going to say this, and I say this with there is no deference to this. I'm proud of this, but what we had to come to understand at Kahua, what we tried to, have a come to Jesus ourselves. We're all project people. Our job, just like you said about being a government guy, our job was to get the project done, get it done on time, on budget, and move on to the next one. Because that's what our world is. There's nothing wrong with that either. It's natural.
Absolutely
We've
not.
got to move on. That's our business, right?
Yep.
But we came to the realization that we're project people and we only focus on the project. And that the people we serve, the agencies we serve, don't think about the project. They think about the asset they're acquiring. Okay? The project's just it's a little phase in the life of this long life of this asset. I was blessed early in my career. I worked for a guy, I had a client. It was the architect of the Capitol. And I worked for a man named John Weber, who was effectively the chief operating officer for this federal agency called the Architect of the Capitol. John was giving me a tour of one of the Senate buildings that he helped take care of. And it was fascinating to me because I'm a young design engineer, and he's talking to me about the challenges of doing design and construction on Capitol Hill. He says, our buildings are all monuments. No one else in the world maintains a fleet of buildings like we do. And he showed me a door jamb that was 30 inches of granite. He says, who else has a door jamb like this, right? And he talked to me about when you put a handrail up in a public park, you want it to last 50 years. So you get an anodized aluminum or something that's really going to last a long time. He said, well, I want mine to last 500 years. So I get brass. Solid brass. Wow. But it made perfect sense, right? He had the focus of a long-term asset. And I've always been a project guy whose job was to get it done and move on. So at Kahua, we had kind of a revelation that we need to think like an owner, and we need to think about the asset, and we need to make the asset the center of the universe. So you asked me what success means. We're still a project management information system. And our job is still to help people get projects done safely, on time, on budget, high quality. So we're still project people, but we now think like an owner that what we're doing in this project is turning over an asset that will live on for decades to come, perhaps 50, 100 years. So what we do is carry the critical asset data with us through design and construction, procurement, commissioning, all those places where additional data gets added about that asset. And we let the natural processes that add that data collect it in a way that when the project's over and you get the keys to the building, you also get a working database. So on day one, you can begin to maintain and operate that facility in the way you should. Because what we've done, as you said, Kurt, we put it on a thumb drive, we throw it in a drawer, and then we operate blindly until months later, or perhaps years later, someone can create a proper maintenance and operations database. Success to us means handing over asset data in a way that the owner can use it on day one.
That's great. I mean, that's a great answer, because I think, that's exactly kind of, you separated it and to kind of give the perspective to what the owner is thinking about versus kind of the project itself. Certainly they have to be successful in the project completion, but they have to maintain that for, to your point, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, right?
And I'll say, Kurt, we've done this wrong for decades. Ever since we went digital, we've done this wrong, because before that, we provided truckloads of paper. Here's all your asset data. It's all the plans. It's every spec sheet. It's every owner's manual. Okay, we stopped doing that, and we thought it was smart because we stopped cutting trees down and we put it all on a thumb drive. That's great. Except it's the way we do it is unusable. It's 50,000 PDFs and it's 1,000 spreadsheets, and
Right.
the owner can't find anything, so they just throw it in the drawer and start over. It's very
Exactly.
expensive, very time consuming. I want to say that, part of the problem has always been that owners have not demanded better.
Yeah.
You've accepted that thumb drive and you threw it in your drawer and you paid somebody else another fee to build it. So
Yeah.
I think it's time from both sides that owners need to demand this now. It is possible. There's a methodology that's proven. There are tools that will do it.
Mm-hmm.
You should
Yeah.
open your facility, your utility, your transportation unit, whatever it is, you should open it with a working database.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Carrie, you want to add? I'm going to pop up another poll question here for the audience, but Carrie, if you want to add on to that, please do.
So I'm going to say part of what Nicholas has said is true. I am a project person, but my aha moment came when I was working with a utility to come up with a life cycle approach to asset health and replacement, and how that feeds into the capital planning process. And so Nicholas just talked about the end of the project. I'm going to talk about the beginning of the project as the aha and why it's important. Because especially with cities that have assets that have been around for 500 plus years, we have this replacement concept of these assets. And in order, not just at the big building level, but at the micro level, the HVAC level, right? So all of these dollars add up. And you have to decide, do we want to replace and renew a whole floor? Do we want to replace a building? Do we just want to replace functioning assets within this space as part of that project planning? Going back to having fewer dollars instead of these really great replacements, sometimes we're refurbishing what we already have. So understanding and be able to have good data about what you already have as a predecessor to understanding that project is also really important. So I would say kind of, again, my aha moment was about 8 years ago when we were trying to figure out the capital planning progress based on data. And we said, oh, we actually have very inconsistent data on what infrastructure is actually out there. This also applies to the horizontal side of the house, right? So a lot of cities have pipes out there that they don't know exist, or documentation shows that the pipe is 20 feet to the left until they go in there and do a renewal on a road, and they're trying to survey that, figure out what's going on, and they uncover a pipe. And I love stories of coming and like uncovering concrete pipes when they thought that they were actually metal pipes or copper pipes. So
Right.
A lot of times, especially if it's buried underground, we have no idea what we're doing till we actually get into that. And we all know surprises in projects cost money.
Yeah, I mean I know I live up in the Northeast, right? So in our infrastructure, especially when you're talking about pipes, very, very old, right? Late 1800s, early 1900s, and I think especially if you live in a small town, you rely on state money to kind of do projects and stuff, and having those, having that aha moment, really kind of can devastate a community really at the end of the day, or just really cause havoc, right? Or your business closed down if you don't have the appropriate infrastructure, like water infrastructure, right?
Right.
So I think having that, I guess the important part I take out of that is that this really, in today's world, into what you all do and the products and the approach and the consultations, is really help government kind of think about that future forward as well, and really kind of having that opportunity, especially I think over the past maybe 5-10 years, to invest in the right technology. And again, I think, data and government has a ton of data, right? Community data, but just having that data and be able to use it, to do your budget planning, to do your, mitigation or whatever it's going to be. So I think having that approach and having that technology and having that, the data, I think is critical. I do want to, before we go to the poll results, I hear this term all the time, single source of truth, right? And I think it goes to many different areas. But in the context of what we're talking about today, Carrie, Nick, can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think, what does that really mean? Is it real? Is there a single source of truth, or is it really, putting it all together in a in a framework or form that I know, Nicholas, I think you and I have talked about this in the past. I think you have a very strong feeling about this, but let me start with Carrie and then move to Nick.
Yeah, so my statement is single source of truth, but not in a single system. So,
Okay.
so when I look at projects and when I look at technology and how it can be optimized, I look at taxonomy and data governance. And so when I say there's a project name, when I say single source of truth, I expect that project name, no matter what system I'm looking at, to be called the same thing, not because my ERP only allows 16 characters and my PMIS allows 32 characters. They're called two different projects in two different systems. So I would say, yes, you do need to have a single source of truth, but it's on the data governance side and on the taxonomy side, not the technology side.
Oh, that's interesting. That's great. That's great observation. Nick, I want to hear what you have to say on this one.
That's the great observation you get from a really wise consultant. So now you'll hear from the software vendor. Kurt, usually, where I hear this most, and I have to say, we're probably guilty of using it inside my company, but I hear a lot of people in my space that sell project management software. I hear a lot of people talk about the single source of truth, and for the most part, when I hear it, I want to go, step out of the booth. That's the wrong answer.
Yep.
That's, I don't believe there is a single source of truth. I think we ought to stop using that term. I think it is a good thing to reduce your sources of truth. But what I focus on is project management information. Okay. I focus on a lot of very dynamic, actionable items, things that happen on a construction project during construction. As Carrie said, unknown things cost money. And if I'm managing a project, I have to know about all those unknown things that might cost me money. If I'm back in the office running the ERP, the accounting system, I could care less about your potential cost. I only want you to know, do I need to pay this vendor, or are you going to send me a check? Do I need to send money out or in? That's all I care about. I don't care about all this potential stuff. So there's going to be an ERP. There's going to be a back office accounting system. There needs to be a project management information system. We talked about the handoff to the maintenance and operations tools. We usually refer to those as CMMS, computerized maintenance management systems. Okay. What we do in projects is not the same thing as what folks do in operations. So they need a unique set of tools. We need a unique set of tools. The administrative team in the office needs a unique set of tools. So there's multiple sources of truth. There's multiple sources of data. If you can eliminate some of those, that's good. If you can make those remaining sources talk to one another, and to Carrie's point, speak a common language, now you've accomplished something. I'll give you an example, and our example comes from the United States General Services Administration, the GSA. We deployed Kahua there, and we are still eliminating silos of data. Immediately, we went in and replaced 20 commercial off-the-shelf software applications, what we refer to as point solutions, products that did one thing for the agency. Okay, we were able to do those.
Or one person. Or
perhaps for one person, right? Yeah. So 20 different softwares that they were paying for every year, they no longer have to pay for because Kahua was able to do those things for them. There were also over 20, I believe the number was 24 initially, this probably grown, but initially there were 24 homegrown applications that we eliminated. Those were not software that they had to pay for, but one of their staff had to maintain those applications. It might have been a glorified spreadsheet, it might have been an Access or SQL database, but they had created their own applications. The most important point, though, those were 24 more sources of information, sources of truth. So just in those two, we eliminated 44 sources of information. We've also integrated with over 20 other applications because they do have an ERP. They do have accounting systems. They do have systems that manage all kind of other processes for them. So we've made Kahua talk to those things. So now we've reduced over 60 sources of truth. All right. So it's not a panacea. It's not paradise, but it's 60 sources better than it used to be. Right. So it's 60 sources of data more accurate than it ever could be before. So the key is to have as few sources of truth as possible and to make them communicate with one another well. And we feel like we excel at that. Again, that was Carrie's point. There are going to be other sources. They just need to speak a common language. Carrie, can you add
I think.
Oh, I was going to say, 60 less sources of truth isn't as catch worthy as a single source of truth, Nicholas.
Would you all refer to, I mean, as I hear the term connected systems too, is that kind of what you're all talking about as well, from your perspective, Kara, when you talked a little bit ago?
Yeah, and connected systems. And I would say also, again, we saw the 70%, a mix of manual and automated processes, right? I would say, especially the vision that the construction industry has placed for us, those big four always giving us the construction 3.0, VR headsets, helping us to do all of that. But the first step is to eliminate the manual so that at least everybody's looking at the same data, right? And then, going back to that whole thing of one system talking to another, data has become so important. You said it earlier, public agencies have so much access to data. If you look at Esri tools and these public agencies feeding information into Esri, why can't we have a vision of combining 16 sources of data along with the Esri data from our peers and use that to start making decisions, right? So I think that is our future.
That's a great example. I happen to know that Carrie's team has developed an integration between project management tools like Kahua and Esri, because cities and counties almost all use Esri to map out their assets, to map out all kind of things. So your project tool needs to be able to talk to your mapping tool. So she's made that happen. It's pretty cool. Now, Kurt, you said the term connected systems, and I was referring to things inside the GSA's agency. All of those 64 different, and now that number is higher now, but all those 60 something different systems were all owned and operated by GSA. There's another way that we use that term, connected systems, and it's when we talk about connected PMIS, connected project management tools. Because as an owner, if I'm running an agency, I'm going to own my own project management information system, and I'm going to require my team to use it. Now, if I'm a large general contractor and I want to do work for your agency, I'm going to have to use your system. But if I'm a large general contractor, I've got my own system. I've got to keep my own records, because if you and I have a disagreement, I need access to all the information. So I've got to have my own records. So, and the same is true, by the way, for contractors and their subcontractors or specialty contractors. The same kind of tension exists between. So everybody needs their own copy of the information, because it's the record of their business. You've got to have that. So what contractor winds up doing in this case is going into his system and creating all the data for all the documentation he's doing, and then copying that up into the owner's system. Okay. Kurt, you were the owner. Who do you think paid for that double entry?
I presume I paid for it.
You pay for everything on the job.
Everything. I mean, no free lunch. No free lunch in government. Absolutely. No free lunch. Absolutely.
There's no free lunch on any construction project. If somebody has to do it twice, the owner's paying for it. It's built into the contractor's cost. You're paying for it. And if there is if I have to do things twice, let's just say, I've got to log 1,000 numbers into my system and then put them into your system. If I'm rekeying those numbers, how many am I going to get wrong? And
absolutely, what's the consequence of that? Yeah. So no, absolutely. It's always a challenge.
We use a term connected PMIS, which is the ability for the owner to use a tool like Kahua and the contractor to use a tool like Kahua, and even the subcontractors to use it, and each to use their own instance of that tool. So I'm the contractor. I own everything I create. When I hit the button to submit it to my owner, the owner gets a copy, and now he owns that exact copy. He owns what he received. I own what I sent. If he marks it up, sends it back, he owns what he marked up and sent back, and I own what I received. So everybody gets to keep everything that they author. It's an incredible, it's just like the conversation about turning over the asset data. This is a problem we've had since we went digital. We've been doing everything multiple times, and that's no longer necessary. So again, we're seeing owners in the public sector beginning to mandate this kind of technology, because in the end, they know they pay for all the mistakes and all the duplicate entry.
Yep. I'm great point. I mean, I think, that's just the way government's been for years and projects. So, I mean, I think having that kind of capability now and capacity to do that, and the discipline, and I presume, Carrie, on your side from a consultation perspective and advising your customers and working with their customers because a lot of this, you have to teach people how to do this and kind of make them aware of it, and certainly make the investment to do it. And I think everybody comes out better here, both the vendor and, to your point, I think, Nicholas, the subcontractors, on these projects, there could be 10, 15, 20 different subcontractors or more, right? I mean, on these large construction projects, large and small. So having that record, having that data available, tremendous. Listen, we've only got a few minutes left. We've got about maybe 5 or 6 minutes left before we have to wrap. I just want to kind of look at this poll real quick. Which of the following would bring the biggest efficiency gain to your team? Looks like, kind of that centralized document management, integrated collaboration tools. I think, certainly you two have talked about these. Any surprises there, or any thoughts on this before we move on?
I'm disappointed that centralized document management is still an issue for people. That's been solvable for way too long. I'm pleased to see that people want to see integrated collaboration. That's what we're all about. So disappointed that people are still having trouble with document management.
Carrie,
I think when I see that, it's called centralized document management. What I hear is the big pain points there is which document is the document I should be working off of. And, we've had SharePoint available to us as a centralized document management system. That's another one of those inefficiencies versus collaboration challenges we have, right? So just using SharePoint as an example, I can keep it in the SharePoint site and I can go in and I can collaborate there. Or because it's faster and more efficient, I can download it to my own desktop and I can work on my own version and then I can upload it. So this is one of those where I think it's that balance of technology potentially making things more effective, but also potentially not. And I think, it's in my experience, it's less the centralized document management system and more the human side of how we interact with.
I was going to say the same thing. I think, just on the IT space side, when we, decided to go enterprise-wide with 365 a few years ago, and, certainly adoption and change management was a huge component. And we ran into a lot of challenges with SharePoint administrators, and like, whose responsibility was it to kind of set up the site and manage the site and then actually use the site? And then you get into those kind of jurisdictional or kind of infighting within a government organization at times, depending, what agency or what, work group is kind of responsible for it. So I think, from a governance perspective, again, that's why, there still needs to be worked on that side, I think, and it goes with maturity. Certainly the tools are there, but also kind of framing out the expectations and who's the owner and who's driving it, from a PM or a support team as well. So I think that's always a challenge, but I do feel like it's getting better in that space. We're going to put up another quick poll question, but we've only got about 5 minutes left. I wanted to get in real quick, Nicholas, on the digital twins, and this is kind of a big thing coming up lately more and more. And I think that a lot of people don't know what digital twins is from a technology perspective. Can you touch briefly? I know it probably deserves more time than we have, but
We could
touch
have a whole
briefly?
other session on
Yeah,
that.
it could be a whole other section because I've heard a lot of it, but I've talked to some people in the head. I have no idea what you're talking about. What does that really mean? Do you have time to talk about that for a minute, or kind of save it for another day? You thought?
Well, I think it's a save it for the day because it's a big topic. But very quickly, I'll say a digital twin is a representation of an actual asset. So it's a digital representation, usually associated with a model.
Yep.
We talk so much about it here. My caution is that I don't see agencies using digital twin in maintenance and operations.
Okay.
The digital realm, the 3D model is incredibly valuable. The 5D model is incredibly valuable during design and construction. Mm-hmm. I don't see operators taking advantage of it. So I always enter these conversations cautiously because it's not the end all be all that's going to save the universe.
Right.
We're not using it hardly at all in operations. Its usefulness generally declines toward the end of construction. Not that it should. I'm not saying it should, but there's a lot that's been promised for a long time, and on operations, it hasn't been delivered.
Yeah.
Here's what I'll say about digital twin. I love that it's causing executives to sponsor movement to digital solutions.
Okay.
What I think, and when I think digital twin will be used, is when we can turn the data that we receive from our digital solutions, not just one, all of it, our building management systems, our efficiency systems, into actions. So I'm monitoring asset health through vibrations sitting on something, and that causes an alarm to happen that triggers a work order, and now I go out and look at that asset instead of waiting till fill. Mm-hmm. And so, I would love to have a whole session just on this. But in short, I think it's great to move towards something, but we still have quite a long ways to go.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. I've talked to some folks over the past year or so about it, and to get a better grasp on it. And I had it was like 50-50. Like, I had no idea. I mean, I've heard of it, but I don't really know how to kind of think about it. So I think to your point, Carrie, about it's a conversation starter. It's getting executives to think about it, which I think is great. So I do think, kind of a topic of that would be great at some point. I'd certainly love to learn more. I'm going to pop up these results before I just kind of wrap up real quick. So biggest roadblock adopting construction technology looks like, pretty consistent across the board. Everything is on the board there.
They're just all the challenges.
Yeah, all the challenges. So listen, as we close out, we've got about a minute left. Nick, let me start with you. As we close, I'd like to ask each of you just kind of one critical gap in a large scale project. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I know we've talked about kind of the whole. Anything else you kind of want to add to that?
No, sir. What I'll say is that we talked about two critical gaps that there are now solutions for.
Yep.
They're just beginning to come on the market. So I want to emphasize that you can have a working asset database at the beginning of your operations at the end of a project. That is a historic gap that's been solved. If your vendor can't provide that for you, call us. Okay. The other one is that we don't all have to create the data multiple times. Every sub doesn't have to put it in his and the GC system, and every GC doesn't have to put it in his and the owner's system. That problem's been solved. If your vendor's not solved that for you, give us a call.
Gary, how do you get those government agencies to do that? How do you get them to kind of like do what Nicholas just said to do?
Well, we love solving problems. So I'd say we have to start out with a problem statement, and typically executives want to see an ROI. So I talk a lot about qualitative and quantitative ways to measure ROI. So that's where I would say, jokingly, call us.
That's great. So audience,
Kurt, I'll tell you
both.
Kurt, I'll tell you that the asset-centric project management methodology, every owner we show that to is ready to engage. So it will take off like fire. And the other one, the connected PMIS networks, we're going to find traction in that as well. That's actually very The budget for that turnover problem is higher in the UK, so we're seeing a lot of interest there. So maybe we get led there from the other side.
That's great. And I would say, just, we were talking earlier, and I'm a Massachusetts guy, and I was just informed the other day that one of our large state organizations just acquired the product. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so it's really great to see that kind of investment by at least my state government up here in Massachusetts, to do a better job and to be more accountable and have the appropriate tools to manage the project. So folks, thank you for joining us today. And thank you for joining us today, Carrie and Nick, and thank you to Kahua for sponsoring this, and certainly very, very informative webinar today. And the webinar will be available on webinars.govtech.com. Any question, you can contact our Senior Success Manager there, Shannon Quist. So folks, thank you so much. And Nick and Carrie, thank you so much. It was great to see you all. And you all have a great summer. Thanks again for joining us today, folks. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Go Bulldogs.